August 25, 1944, Cherbourg Harbor, Normandy, France. The heavy tool slipped from Sergeant William Henderson's oil-smeared fingers as he surveyed the immense procession taking shape before him. The British had voiced their doubts about these vehicles' efficacy. They'd declared the engineering flawed, the power inadequate, and entirely unsuitable for modern combat. Yet, here was Henderson, witnessing 6,000 of them poised to undertake what seemed an insurmountable task, supplying General Patton's rapidly advancing Third Army across 400 miles of war-torn French countryside. The GMC emblem emblazoned on their bonnets, signifying General Motors Corporation, held a far deeper meaning for the 75% of drivers who were African American. As these men, weary before their mission even commenced, climbed into the cabs, those letters represented something profoundly different. They signified a chance for survival. They symbolized the crucial distinction between triumph and defeat. They were the vital link that would enable Allied forces to press onward towards Germany. What remained unknown to them on that August morning was that these trucks, dismissed as insufficient by British military analysts a mere 4 years prior, would ultimately prove more invaluable than armored vehicles, more critical than aircraft, and more indispensable than any other weapon system in the European theater. The unassuming 2.5-ton GMC CCKW, affectionately known as the Jimmy or the Deuce and a Half, was on the cusp of etching its name in history as the bedrock of the most perilous logistical undertaking the world had ever witnessed. This narrative commences not amidst the ferocity of conflict, but within the tranquil design studios of General Motors in 1939. The United States Army Ordnance Corps had articulated its requirements for a new medium tactical truck. Their specifications called for a vehicle capable of carrying a 2.5-ton payload, equipped with 6-wheel drive, and engineered to operate effectively in any weather condition across varied terrain. The request appeared straightforward, but the ensuing solution proved to be anything but. The General Motors Truck and Coach Division, operating from its facility in Pontiac, Michigan, approached the challenge by adapting components from their commercially produced trucks. They modified their existing AX series truck design, implementing crucial alterations: an additional rear axle for enhanced traction and load distribution, all-wheel drive for off-road performance, and reinforced frame rails to accommodate military demands. The resulting model was designated ACKW X353, the precursor to what would ultimately become the CCKW. The initial iteration of this design featured a GMC 248 cubic inch inline 6-cylinder engine that produced a modest 77 horsepower. The trucks weighed 9,856 pounds when empty and measured 264 inches in length, 94.5 inches in width, and 118 inches in height. By civilian industry standards, they were deemed adequate, but by military benchmarks, they were met with considerable skepticism. France placed an order for 1,000 of these experimental 6x6 trucks in late 1939. Production commenced at the Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company's production facilities. These vehicles were outfitted with enclosed steel cabs, rigid side panels, troop seating, and a conventional aesthetic that would have been perfectly at home on civilian construction sites. They were, in essence, commercial trucks disguised in military attire. Then, the cataclysmic events of May 1940 unfolded. German panzer divisions tore through the Ardennes forest, circumventing the Maginot Line and penetrating deep into France. The French army, despite possessing some of Europe's most sophisticated tanks and fortifications, buckled under the swift and synchronized assault of German combined arms warfare. The British Expeditionary Force was forced to retreat to Dunkirk, and France capitulated within 6 weeks. 2,000 of the ACKWX trucks had already been delivered to France. They were subsequently seized by German forces and ironically found service with the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, where German soldiers grudgingly acknowledged their dependability. The remainder of the order, along with additional units still in production, was rerouted to Great Britain under emergency wartime agreements. The British Army received the ACKWX trucks in the summer of 1940 and immediately subjected them to stringent evaluations. British military assessors were decidedly unimpressed. Their findings, preserved in military archives, were overwhelmingly critical. The wheelbase was deemed excessively long for European roadways and trails. Maneuvering the trucks in confined areas proved challenging. The 77-horsepower engine was considered underpowered for the vehicle's substantial weight, particularly when fully loaded. Acceleration was sluggish, and their ability to ascend inclines was marginal. Despite their six-wheel drive, the trucks struggled significantly in muddy and soft ground conditions. British Army officials concluded that the ACKWX was unsuitable for the demands of modern mechanized warfare, declaring the design fundamentally flawed. Rather than commit these vehicles to combat roles where British lives might be jeopardized, the War Office made a decisive choice. They diverted approximately 1,000 units to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease agreements in 1941. A total of 2,466 ACKWX trucks were manufactured for all recipients combined. This British rejection appeared to validate concerns that American truck manufacturers, accustomed to expansive highways and relatively gentle landscapes, were incapable of producing vehicles appropriate for European conflict. General Motors engineers, stung by this assessment, returned to their design tables. The lessons learned from the ACKWX experience were clear. Increased power was essential, the chassis required refinement, and the wheelbase needed to offer options for various operational needs. However, the core concept, a 6x6 medium tactical truck constructed from commercial parts for rapid mass production, remained sound. American engineers grasped a fundamental principle that their British counterparts had overlooked. The objective was not to engineer the perfect truck, but to produce adequate trucks in sheer numbers that would overwhelm any adversary through superior industrial capacity. In 1941, General Motors unveiled its redesigned iteration, designated the CCKW. This nomenclature derived from GMC's internal coding system. C signified a design introduced in 1941. The second C denoted a conventional cab design. K indicated all-wheel drive, and W signified dual tandem rear axles. The enhancements over the ACKWX were significant, though not revolutionary. The new GMC 270 cubic inch inline six-cylinder engine replaced the 248, generating 104 horsepower at 2,750 revolutions per minute. This increase of 27 horsepower might seem modest, but it dramatically transformed the truck's performance. The engine delivered 216 foot-pounds of torque at 1,400 revolutions per minute, providing the crucial low-end power necessary for heavy loads and steep gradients. Engineers developed two wheelbase configurations. The CCKW 352, with a 145-inch wheelbase, served as a shorter wheelbase variant primarily for artillery tractor duties, and the CCKW 353, with a 164-inch wheelbase, became the standard cargo configuration. This adaptability allowed a single basic truck model to fulfill diverse roles across various combat units. The frame was a conventional ladder-type structure with riveted crossmembers, simple to manufacture and repair. Three-driven beam axles provided the six-wheel drive capability. The front axle was mounted on leaf springs, while the rear tandem utilized leaf springs supplemented by locating arms to manage axle articulation. Braking was hydraulic with vacuum assistance, a notable advancement over older mechanical systems. The tires were 750 by 20, offering adequate ground clearance and load-bearing capacity. Early production models retained the enclosed metal cab from the ACKWX design. However, as wartime production intensified and steel became a strategically rationed material, GMC engineers made a critical decision. Commencing in July 1943, new CCKW trucks were fitted with open cabs featuring canvas tops and removable doors. This modification resulted in a saving of approximately 150 pounds of steel per vehicle. When multiplied by hundreds of thousands of trucks, this steel conservation translated into enough material to construct dozens of destroyers or hundreds of tanks. The cargo bed underwent several evolutionary changes, driven by material constraints. Initial trucks featured all-steel beds, which proved excessively heavy. Wooden beds were subsequently introduced, but were prone to warping and cracking under military loads. A composite design incorporating steel framing with wooden floor slats also proved insufficient. The final iteration reverted to a simplified all-steel construction, minimizing material waste while preserving durability. The outcome was a truck that prioritized simplicity, reliability, and ease of mass production over outright performance. The CCKW would never win speed contests, nor would it impress engineers with its sophisticated technology. However, it could be manufactured in vast quantities by semi-skilled labor using readily available materials, and it could be repaired in field conditions by mechanics possessing basic tools and limited training. General Motors awarded the primary production contract to their yellow truck and coach facility in Pontiac, Michigan. As orders escalated, Chevrolet's St. Louis, Missouri plant joined the production effort. At their peak output, these two facilities were completing one CCKW truck every 7 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The assembly lines operated continuously. The manufacturing process itself epitomized American industrial might. Raw materials entered one end of the Pontiac plant, and finished trucks emerged from the other. Sheet metal was stamped into body panels. Frames were welded and riveted. Engines were assembled from hundreds of precision components. Transmissions, axles, and suspension systems were manufactured at separate facilities and then transported for final assembly. The entire operation employed tens of thousands of workers, many of whom were women who had entered the workforce to fill the positions vacated by men serving in combat roles. Production figures vividly illustrate America's industrial mobilization. From 1941 through 1945, General Motors produced approximately 562,750 CCKW trucks across all variants, a figure that includes specialized models but primarily represents standard production units. Excluding cab-over-engine variants and non-all-wheel drive models, standard CCKW production totaled approximately 518,000 to 519,000 units. To provide context, Germany manufactured approximately 100,000 trucks of all types during the same period. The Soviet Union, despite substantial American Lend-Lease aid, produced fewer than 200,000 trucks. Great Britain's entire wartime truck output was dwarfed by this single American model. The CCKW alone nearly matched the combined truck production of all Axis powers. The CCKW gave rise to dozens of specialized variants: dump trucks for engineer units, tankers for fuel and water transport, mobile workshops equipped with lathes and welding equipment, communications vans, housing and radio equipment units, ambulances outfitted with medical supplies and stretcher racks, wrecker trucks equipped with cranes for recovering disabled vehicles, and anti-aircraft platforms mounting quadruple 50 caliber machine guns. Each variant utilized the same fundamental chassis, engine, and drivetrain, thereby simplifying maintenance and spare parts logistics. However, sheer numbers are meaningless without practical application. And in June 1944, the CCKW faced its most significant trial. This test would not come from German anti-tank weaponry or Luftwaffe bombers, but from the fundamental principles of physics, the relentless demands of distance, and the stark realities of logistical mathematics. June 6, 1944. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers landed on 5 Normandy beaches, marking the largest amphibious invasion in history. This operation achieved tactical surprise and established a foothold on Hitler's Atlantic Wall. But establishing a foothold is not synonymous with victory. By mid-July, more than 1 million Allied troops were confined to a pocket approximately 50 miles wide and 20 miles deep, making little to no forward progress. The Germans had transformed Normandy into a formidable defensive landscape. Ancient hedgerows, dense earthen and vegetative barriers dating back centuries, divided the terrain into countless small fields. Each hedgerow served as an entrenched defensive position, and each field evolved into a distinct battleground. American infantry and armor painstakingly advanced through this broken terrain at a horrific cost, gaining yards rather than miles. Then came Operation Cobra. On July 25, 1944, American forces launched a massive breakout attempt, supported by intense aerial bombardment. Within days, the German defensive lines fractured. American armored divisions surged through the breach. By early August, General George Patton's Third Army was racing across open French countryside, covering 50, 60, and at times 80 miles per day. This rapid advance threatened to encircle and annihilate entire German armies. However, Patton's tank crews soon encountered a more formidable adversary than any panzer division. They were running out of fuel. Each Sherman tank consumed approximately 150 gallons of gasoline per 100 miles of travel. An armored division, comprising around 250 tanks, burned through immense quantities during swift advances. When factoring in trucks, jeeps, and other vehicles, fuel consumption reached staggering levels. Patton commanded multiple divisions spread across hundreds of miles of front line. His daily fuel requirements alone exceeded 400,000 gallons. The First Army required similar volumes, and British and Canadian forces necessitated their own distinct supply lines. Total Allied fuel consumption in early August 1944 surpassed 3 million gallons per day. The Allies had anticipated a rapid advance and had established supply depots and logistical networks, but no one had foreseen a breakthrough of such magnitude. Within 2 weeks of the Cobra breakout, American spearheads were 200 miles from the Normandy beaches. Within a month, lead elements had advanced to within 350 miles of their supply bases. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every can of rations had to traverse that distance over war-damaged roads, through a French transportation infrastructure that Allied bombing had systematically demolished in the months preceding D-Day. The destruction of French railways had been a deliberate strategic objective. To impede the arrival of German reinforcements at the invasion beaches, Allied air forces had spent April, May, and June of 1944 systematically targeting every rail yard, bridge, and marshalling center within 200 miles of Normandy. This campaign achieved remarkable success, delaying German panzer divisions' arrival at the front by weeks instead of days. However, these same bombed railways could no longer support the Allied armies advancing towards Germany. The Mulberry harbors, those extraordinary artificial ports towed across the English Channel, had sustained the invasion force throughout June and July. But a severe storm in mid-June had annihilated the American Mulberry. The British Mulberry at Arromanches remained operational, but could not accommodate the tonnage requirements for 2 entire army groups. Cherbourg had been captured, but its port facilities had been so thoroughly devastated by German engineers that their restoration would take months. In late August 1944, American commanders faced a critical juncture. Patton's tanks were running critically low on fuel 300 miles from their supply bases. The First Army was rationing ammunition, and combat effectiveness hung precariously in the balance. Without immediate and substantial resupply, the Allied advance would grind to a halt. German forces would gain precious time to establish new defensive lines, jeopardizing the opportunity to conclude the war in 1944. On August 21, 1944, American logistics officers convened an emergency planning conference. 36 hours of continuous meetings produced a solution so desperate and audacious it could only have originated from Americans accustomed to transcontinental highways and extensive trucking networks. They resolved to establish a dedicated express convoy system akin to priority freight trains. Every available truck would be mobilized for continuous service. 2 one-way routes would be created, originating from Normandy and extending to forward supply points. All civilian traffic would be prohibited, and military police would control every intersection to ensure uninterrupted convoy movement. This ambitious plan necessitated more trucks than any single command possessed. Within hours, logistics officers began requisitioning trucks from every non-essential unit across the European theater. Artillery battalions surrendered their prime movers, engineer units, their construction equipment haulers, medical companies, their ambulances, and infantry divisions, their organic transportation. Every truck deemed operational was incorporated into the effort. The primary vehicle for this undertaking was the GMC CCKW. By August 1944, tens of thousands of these trucks had been deployed to Europe. They were parked in motor pools, stationed at supply depots, and dispersed throughout the rear areas. Now, they were being marshaled for what would become the most extensive truck convoy in history. 6,000 vehicles were assembled. At its peak, nearly 6,000 trucks were simultaneously in operation on the roads. However, trucks require drivers, and it was here that American racial segregation presented both a crisis and an unexpected opportunity. The United States Army in 1944 remained strictly segregated. African American soldiers served in distinct units under predominantly white officers. Military policy, predicated on racist assumptions, posited that black soldiers lacked the intelligence and courage for combat roles. Consequently, African Americans were predominantly assigned to service units, quartermaster companies, port battalions, and transportation units, including truck drivers. In August 1944, the European theater hosted approximately 210,000 African American soldiers. Nearly half, around 93,000, served within the Quartermaster Corps. When the urgent call for truck drivers went out, these men responded. Not because they relished driving trucks for 60 hours consecutively, nor because they enjoyed being segregated and discriminated against while fighting for freedom abroad. They answered because their country desperately needed them, because combat troops depended on them, and because African American soldiers understood that serving with distinction would advance the cause of civil rights back home. 17,000 African American soldiers became Red Ball Express drivers. An additional 3,000 white soldiers joined their ranks, though in practice, the operation largely remained segregated, with black and white units often operating separate convoys. The drivers' ages ranged from 18 to 40, with the majority being under 24. Many had never driven a truck prior to their military service. Some hailed from urban areas where personal vehicle ownership was uncommon. They received rudimentary training, sometimes only a few days, before being deemed qualified to operate 2.5-ton military trucks, laden with 5 tons of cargo, through active combat zones. The African American soldiers who became Red Ball Express drivers came from every corner of the United States. Farm boys from Mississippi who had operated tractors but never trucks. Factory workers from Detroit familiar with assembly lines but not military logistics. College students whose education was interrupted by conscription. Sons of sharecroppers seeking opportunities beyond the confines of the Jim Crow South. These men, who had endured discrimination throughout their lives, now found themselves entrusted with the war's most critical logistical mission. The Red Ball Express commenced operations on August 25, 1944. The name itself derived from railroad terminology dating back to the late 1800s. Railroad companies marked priority express freight cars with red balls, signaling all other traffic to yield the right-of-way. Now, red balls appeared on signs designating dedicated truck routes across France. Red balls were painted on truck hoods, identifying convoy vehicles. The Red Ball Express system was ingeniously simple. Two parallel one-way routes connected Normandy ports to forward supply depots. The northern route carried loaded trucks towards the front lines, while the southern route returned empty trucks to Normandy, often transporting German prisoners westward as backhaul cargo. The total route length eventually extended to nearly 400 miles as the front line advanced eastward. Convoys officially comprised at least 5 trucks, accompanied by jeep escorts fore and aft. Trucks were instructed to maintain 60-yard intervals and a maximum speed of 25 miles per hour. In reality, individual trucks frequently departed as soon as they were loaded, without waiting for formal convoy formation. Speed limits became suggestions rather than mandates. Drivers removed or disabled engine governors, pushing the CCKW trucks well beyond their designed maximum speed of 56 miles per hour. Some veterans reported speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour, a terrifying velocity for a 2.5-ton truck equipped with 1940s suspension and braking systems. The 793rd Military Police Battalion was responsible for route security and traffic control. Military police officers manned every major intersection, ensuring that Red Ball convoys never halted for cross-traffic. They assisted lost drivers, reported accidents, and waged a continuous but often losing battle against speeding violations. Some MPs resorted to riding with convoys when their jeeps proved too slow to keep pace with the speeding trucks. Each round trip, as the front line shifted further east, took approximately 54 hours. Teams of 2 men piloted the vehicles, sharing the immense workload. In reality, however, both individuals frequently remained alert for the entirety of each journey. The trucks served as the relentless arteries, transporting an unending flow of essential supplies. These included 5-gallon containers of fuel, munitions secured in wooden crates, sustenance provisions packed in cardboard, vital medical kits, replacement components, personal correspondence from loved ones, and, on occasion, unsanctioned cargo such as black market commodities and personal effects. Loading operations at Cherbourg and other Normandy port facilities were conducted around the clock. Stevedores, many of whom were also African American, toiled with remarkable efficiency. A CCKW truck could be fully loaded with 5 tons of material in less than 10 minutes. Drivers would acknowledge receipt of their cargo, obtain navigational directives, and then set off towards the front lines. The directive was simple: no stops, no delays, just keep them moving. The undertaking itself was an arduous trial, defying modern safety standards in countless ways. At night, drivers navigated under complete blackout conditions, relying on minuscule cat's eye blackout lights that offered virtually no illumination. Their navigation relied on memory and the headlights of the truck directly ahead, an exercise in pure instinct. The roads were frequently pockmarked with bomb craters or scarred by artillery fire. Bridges were often compromised, and detours were left unmarked. The peril of becoming disoriented meant wasting precious fuel and causing delays in critical resupply efforts. Despite their diminishing frequency by the close of summer in 1944, German aerial assaults remained a tangible threat. The Luftwaffe could still launch sporadic raids, and a convoy of trucks presented an inviting target. Drivers learned to constantly scan the skies, to discern the distinctive hum of enemy engines, and to disperse off the roadways at the sound of an air raid alarm. Some trucks were equipped with 50 caliber machine guns mounted on swivel rings above the passenger seats. While offering a sense of security, their practical defensive capability was limited. Landmines constituted an ever-present danger. German forces strategically placed these devices along road shoulders and in probable parking areas. Some were elaborate trigger mechanisms, while others were crude devices, buried artillery shells, or captured munitions wired to detonate under the weight of a passing vehicle. Drivers with the Red Ball convoy developed a keen awareness, learning to stick to the paved surfaces, to park only in designated cleared zones, and to vigilantly observe for any signs of disturbed earth or suspicious objects. The most formidable adversary was fatigue. Men pushed their bodies beyond human endurance, fueled by copious amounts of coffee and unwavering determination. Some drivers resorted to benzodrine tablets, amphetamines dispensed by medical personnel to combat exhaustion, although this practice was officially discouraged. While these stimulants kept drivers awake, they also impaired judgment, leading to accidents. Many drivers, therefore, relied instead on potent coffee, cigarettes, and sheer willpower to maintain alertness during these marathon journeys. Accidents became commonplace. Trucks collided with each other, overturned, or veered off the road into obstacles. Drivers succumbed to exhaustion at the wheel despite their utmost efforts. Vehicles veered off the roadways in the darkness. Some of these mishaps proved fatal. The Army assigned relief drivers to accompany the primary pilots, ready to take over when the original driver could no longer operate the vehicle safely. Even with this measure, exhaustion continued to exact its toll. The trucks themselves endured immense strain. Although the CCKW was engineered for military application, its continuous operation without adequate maintenance far exceeded any design specifications. Engines would overheat under the summer sun while hauling maximum loads at high velocities. Transmissions failed under the relentless stress. Clutches would burn out. Brake pads wore down in a matter of days, rather than months. Tires, subjected to overloading and high speeds on rough terrain, suffered catastrophic failures with alarming regularity. Maintenance was a logistical nightmare, often performed under impossible conditions. Mechanics toiled beside roadways, in open fields, or beneath makeshift tarpaulins stretched between vehicles. They were equipped with basic tools and whatever scarce spare parts could be procured. Many repairs were field-expedient solutions, sufficient to get the truck moving again, but not a thorough overhaul. Oil changes were often forgone, and scheduled maintenance was disregarded. Every sacrifice was made to ensure the trucks kept rolling. Mechanics transformed into masters of improvisation. They fashioned gaskets from salvaged materials, bypassed damaged components with ingeniously rigged solutions, and cannibalized parts from one disabled truck to repair another. The inherent simplicity of the CCKW's design made this possible. A mechanic with rudimentary skills could diagnose issues, identify necessary parts, and execute repairs using whatever materials were at hand. This adaptability, born of desperate necessity, proved to be one of the truck's most significant advantages. By the end of August, disabled trucks were a common sight along the Red Ball Express routes. Estimates suggest that upwards of 80 vehicles were simply abandoned when immediate repairs were not feasible. Drivers would salvage usable parts and hitch rides on passing convoys. Wrecker trucks worked ceaselessly to retrieve disabled vehicles, but even they frequently succumbed to the strain. At one point, nearly 30% of the Red Ball trucks were experiencing significant mechanical problems that would have normally rendered them inoperable. However, they were compelled to continue service because the alternative was unacceptable. Yet, the operation surpassed all initial projections. Within 5 days of its commencement, the Red Ball Express reached its maximum operational capacity. On the 29th of August in 1944, 132 truck companies, operating 5,958 vehicles, delivered 12,342 tons of supplies to forward depots. This single day's achievement dwarfed every pre-war logistical estimate. The delivery figures continued to climb, with daily shipments averaging between 10,000 and 12,500 tons. At any given moment, 900 trucks were actively engaged on the roadways. Over the 82 days of its operation, the Red Ball Express convoy transported 412,193 tons of supplies across France. They accumulated a staggering 121 million ton-miles, a metric representing tonnage multiplied by the distance traveled. This sustained effort kept multiple army groups adequately supplied during the most rapid advance in military history. Private James Rucard of the 514th Quartermaster Regiment later recounted his experiences. "We transported anything General Patton required: gasoline, ammunition, food, medical supplies. We delivered it all directly to the front lines, back and forth, ceaselessly." Some drivers encountered enemy ambushes. Rucard's company, fortunately, was spared direct engagement, but the sounds of gunfire were ever present. They had to remain vigilant for V-1 flying bombs, which would drone overhead before descending like conventional ordnance. His most harrowing memories involved witnessing trucks engulfed in flames and the pervasive fear of imminent death. However, as Rucard emphasized, when General Patton declared, "Be there," you were there, even if it meant driving day and night. Rucard's testimony encapsulated the stark reality of Red Ball operations: the constant dread, the bone-crushing fatigue that amplified every mile into 10, the profound sense of pride in knowing their contribution was vital, and the unyielding resolve to persevere regardless of the circumstances. His company completed the journey from Cherbourg to forward depots dozens of times during the operation's 82-day duration. They lost trucks to accidents, mechanical failures, and sporadic enemy actions, but they never failed to deliver their crucial cargo. Corporal Washington Rector of the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company shed light on the complex racial dynamics at play. "You learn to accept discrimination. We were advised against fraternizing with white soldiers for fear of creating complications. Some white drivers would attempt to impede the progress of black drivers and convoys, thereby escalating road hazards. However, the majority of white combat troops held us in high regard. They understood we were risking our lives to provide them with their essential needs." Rector's account illuminated the intricate racial tensions that permeated the Red Ball Express itself. Black and white units frequently operated independently. When interactions did occur, discrimination sometimes manifested in subtle yet demeaning ways. White military police might stop black drivers more often. White mess facilities might serve black drivers last. White drivers might refuse assistance to black drivers experiencing mechanical difficulties. Nevertheless, on the open roads, when German artillery shells rained down, or when a truck broke down far from any support, race often became secondary to the imperative of survival. Black and white drivers occasionally extended aid to one another, transcending the official policies of segregation. The trucks themselves attained a legendary status among the drivers. The CCKW possessed an extraordinary capacity to withstand abuse. They could be overloaded, oversped, subjected to neglect and maintenance, and yet they continued to operate. While they did break down frequently, with transmissions proving to be a weak point and brakes wearing out rapidly, they could be repaired using basic tools. This inherent repairability was paramount. A complex vehicle requiring factory-level intervention would have been rendered useless. The Jimmy truck was simple, and its simplicity ensured its functionality. Drivers developed an intimate understanding of their vehicles. They learned to recognize the unique sound of each component, anticipating imminent failures. They knew precisely how much strain the truck could endure before risking a catastrophic breakdown. They understood which issues could be temporarily disregarded and which demanded immediate attention. This profound familiarity was cultivated through countless days and nights spent behind the wheel, through performing their own repairs, and through repeatedly pushing the vehicles beyond their absolute limits. By September of 1944, the Red Ball Express was supplying depots situated 350 miles from Normandy. The logistical challenges escalated significantly. Extended distances resulted in a reduction in daily tonnage per truck. An increased number of trucks succumbed to breakdowns due to prolonged operational periods. Driver fatigue reached critical levels. The French railway network, which Allied engineers were diligently working to restore, remained largely inoperative. New port facilities, particularly Antwerp in Belgium, were still under German control or too severely damaged to be utilized. The immense strain was palpable across every facet of the operation. Accident rates surged. Some convoys were ambushed by bypassed German units entrenched in isolated pockets. Theft became a growing concern, with valuable cargo disappearing from trucks parked at rest stops. Gasoline, cigarettes, and food rations found their way onto the black markets of liberated French cities, with some illicit goods even appearing in Paris and other urban centers. Drivers and cargo handlers faced accusations, often baseless, which further exacerbated racial tensions. Military police investigated numerous incidents, but recovery of the stolen materials was rarely successful. Nevertheless, the trucks continued to roll, for the alternative was unthinkable. General Patton's Third Army, the vanguard of the Allied advance, consumed supplies at a rate unprecedented in military history. Its armored divisions were engaged in near-continuous combat, expending ammunition at levels that astonished supply officers. Each tank engagement could deplete an entire combat load, necessitating immediate replenishment. Patton's audacious tactics yielded significant results, decimating German divisions and capturing vast territories, but this success was contingent upon the Red Ball Express maintaining his forces adequately fueled and armed. Patton himself recognized the operation's pivotal importance. Though celebrated for his bold, armored maneuvers, he understood that logistics formed the bedrock of all military endeavors. His tanks were rendered useless without fuel, his artillery silenced without shells, and his infantry rendered ineffective without sustenance and ammunition. The Red Ball Express facilitated his rapid advance. Without its unwavering support, the Third Army would have stalled within weeks of its breakout, granting German forces the opportunity to establish formidable defensive lines that could have prolonged the conflict by months or even years. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, also acknowledged the operation's critical significance. In an October dispatch to Red Ball Express personnel, he conveyed his profound gratitude. "To you drivers and mechanics and your officers who keep the Red Ball vehicles constantly moving, I wish to express my deep appreciation. You are doing an excellent job." Eisenhower possessed a more profound understanding of military logistics than most commanders. His prior experience planning Operation Torch in North Africa had firmly established the principle that supply dictated operational feasibility. No amount of tactical brilliance could compensate for logistical failure. The Red Ball Express represented logistics in its most fundamental and essential form: trucks, drivers, and roads. Unpretentious and lacking glamour, yet undeniably vital. Eisenhower's public commendation of the drivers' contributions was unusual for the era and reflected his genuine appreciation for the unglamorous but indispensable nature of their work. The contrast with German logistics was striking and telling. The Wehrmacht, despite its reputation as a modern, mechanized force, heavily depended on horse-drawn transport. Germany employed over 2.8 million horses during World War II for the movement of supplies and equipment. German truck production was hampered by steel shortages, fuel constraints, and manufacturing capacity diverted to armaments. When German mechanized units advanced, they frequently outpaced their logistical support, a problem that contributed to their defeats in Russia and North Africa. German forces in France in 1944 faced a logistical nightmare. Allied air supremacy rendered daylight movement nearly impossible. French resistance fighters actively sabotaged rail lines and ambushed supply convoys. The Wehrmacht's horse-drawn supply system, adequate for static defensive operations, was ill-suited to support mobile warfare. German units often contended with ammunition shortages, insufficient food supplies, and chronic fuel deficiencies. Captured German soldiers informed interrogators that American logistical superiority was as demoralizing as American firepower superiority. By mid-November 1944, the strategic landscape had shifted sufficiently to permit the Red Ball Express to cease its operations. The port facilities at Antwerp, finally cleared of German demolition charges, were opened to Allied shipping. This shorter supply line from Antwerp to the front significantly reduced trucking distances. French railroads, painstakingly repaired by American and British engineers, commenced limited operations. Portable gasoline pipelines laid across France began delivering fuel directly to forward depots. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially concluded its 82-day mission. The drivers, many utterly exhausted beyond anything they had previously experienced, rejoined their original units. Some continued their service in other supply capacities, while others transferred to combat roles as the Army, desperate for infantry replacements, began accepting African American volunteers for frontline duty. The final statistics painted a picture of achievement that military planners continue to study. 412,193 tons delivered, 6,000 trucks in peak operation, 23,000 drivers and support personnel, with 75% being African American, averaging 900 vehicles on the road simultaneously. They covered distances of up to 400 miles one way, operating continuously for 82 days without respite. However, the true narrative belonged to the truck. The GMC CCKW, initially dismissed by British experts as inadequate, proved to be the most valuable tactical vehicle of World War II. Its simplicity, the very characteristic that led to its perceived inferiority, was its greatest asset. Drivers could repair CCKWs with basic tools. Mechanics could maintain them in operation with improvised parts. The trucks could endure abuse, overloading, and neglect, yet they continued to function. The CCKW's resilience under duress became legendary. Stories circulated of trucks operating with cracked engine blocks held together by wire and sheer determination, of transmissions that should have failed but continued to shift gears through sheer mechanical stubbornness, of trucks that limped into depots with flat tires, overheated engines, and failing brakes, delivered their cargo, received hurried repairs, and were back on the road hours later. The truck's simple, robust design meant that even severely damaged vehicles could often limp to their destinations. General Patton unequivocally stated that the 2.5-ton truck was their most valuable weapon. He understood a truth many civilians failed to grasp. Without supply, armies devolve into disorganized crowds. Tanks are rendered useless without fuel, like sculptures without form. Rifles without ammunition become mere clubs. The most advanced weaponry is rendered impotent if it cannot be sustained. The unassuming CCKW truck made modern mechanized warfare a reality by resolving the unglamorous yet critical challenge of supply movement. Colonel John Eisenhower, son of the Supreme Commander and a veteran logistics officer himself, wrote after the war that without the Red Ball truck drivers, the advance across France would have been impossible. The trucks, specifically the GMC CCKW, enabled American forces to maintain their momentum at a time when any pause would have allowed German defenses to solidify. The war might have extended into 1946 without this logistical triumph. In December of 1944, the concept faced its ultimate test. German forces launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes Offensive, more commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's final major offensive in the West caught American forces by surprise, creating a perilous salient in the Allied lines. The situation demanded massive, rapid reinforcement and resupply. The Red Ball Express was officially concluded, but the trucks and their drivers remained ready. Reformed under different designations, including the Little Red Ball, the White Ball Express, and others, convoy operations were reinstituted. The same GMC CCKWs that had supplied Patton's advance now rushed reinforcements to contain the German breakthrough. The same African-American drivers who had proven their mettle in the summer returned to the roads under winter conditions that made the challenges of August seem trivial. Snow and ice blanketed French and Belgian roadways. Blackout driving became even more perilous. German air attacks intensified as the Luftwaffe committed its remaining reserves to support the offensive. Yet, the trucks rolled onward. Ammunition reached besieged American units. Fuel kept tanks and trucks mobile. Reinforcements arrived to stabilize the shoulders of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was ultimately won by combat troops engaged in desperate fighting, but it was sustained by truck drivers who maintained open supply lines amidst the harshest winter weather Europe had experienced in decades. Winter operations presented new and significant challenges. Engines would freeze solid overnight, requiring time-consuming thawing before starting. Ice-covered roads rendered speed limits meaningless, as trucks slid uncontrollably regardless of driver skill. Snowdrifts obstructed routes, necessitating hours of arduous digging to clear passage. Frostbite became a constant threat for drivers operating in open cab trucks with minimal heating. Nevertheless, the supply convoys persevered, demonstrating that the logistics system developed during the Red Ball Express era could adapt to any environmental conditions. Following Germany's surrender in May of 1945, the CCKW continued its service. Trucks that had traversed France in 1944 now occupied Germany. They transported displaced persons to refugee camps, distributed food to starving civilian populations, and conveyed occupation troops across the defeated Reich. Some were shipped to the Pacific Theater, where they participated in campaigns in the Philippines and on Okinawa. Production of the CCKW continued until 1945. By the war's conclusion, General Motors had manufactured more CCKW trucks than Germany produced vehicles of all types combined. The total output, approximately 562,750 units, surpassed the entire pre-war truck inventory of most nations. These trucks served not only America, but also supplied Allied forces worldwide through Lend-Lease programs. British, French, Soviet, and Canadian armies all operated GMC CCKWs. The truck's inherent simplicity translated to remarkable longevity. CCKWs remained in active American military service through the 1960s. While the M35 series trucks succeeded the design in the 1950s, older CCKWs continued to be utilized by National Guard and Reserve units for years afterward. Many were sold as surplus to foreign militaries, where they continued to serve into the 1970s and 80s. Some remain operational today in the hands of collectors and museums. The Red Ball Express drivers, particularly the predominantly African-American contingent, received recognition slowly and incompletely. The operation garnered publicity during the war, featuring in newsreels and magazine articles. However, the racial dimension was often downplayed or omitted in media intended for a segregated American audience. The 1952 film Red Ball Express, while acknowledging African American participation, was modified at the insistence of the Department of Defense to depict racial integration that did not exist in 1944. Many Red Ball veterans returned to an America still deeply divided by segregation. Men who had risked their lives fighting fascism faced discrimination in housing, employment, and civil rights. Some utilized GI Bill benefits to pursue education and home loans, although even these benefits were often more difficult for African Americans to access. Banks denied loans, universities imposed quotas, and employers frequently overlooked qualified black veterans in favor of white applicants. Others found their military service dismissed or forgotten. Yet, the story of their contribution endured. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, historical examinations of the Red Ball Express's operations intensified. Accounts from seasoned veterans were systematically gathered and safeguarded. Educational institutions established exhibitions dedicated to showcasing the convoy system and the soldiers who ensured its efficacy. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans prominently displays an extensive collection of Red Ball Express artifacts, including meticulously restored GMC CCKW trucks and personal narratives from the drivers. James Rucard, who served with the 514th Quartermaster Regiment, later shared with journalists, "I am proud of my service. We were young and we were fearful, but we performed the necessary duties." Many white individuals held the belief that black soldiers were incapable of assuming significant responsibilities. We unequivocally disproved their prejudiced assumptions. Every replenishment shipment that successfully reached the front lines on schedule was a testament to our proving our entitlement to esteem. That was our contribution to the fight for liberty, both abroad and within our own borders. Rucard's declaration powerfully encapsulated the dual perspective of African American veterans of World War II. They fought for an American triumph while simultaneously confronting the reality of their nation's denial of their full civic rights. They risked their lives for a country that maintained segregation, subjected them to prejudice, and frequently neglected to acknowledge their vital contributions. Nevertheless, they served with remarkable distinction, understanding that their performance under duress would further the larger cause of civil rights. The Red Ball Express became another significant chapter in the enduring narrative of African Americans demonstrating their inherent value to a nation fraught with skepticism. The operational insights gained from the Red Ball Express profoundly shaped American military logistics for many decades. The principle of uninterrupted supply convoys, along with designated routes managed by priority traffic control and large-scale trucking endeavors, evolved into standard military doctrine. During the Korean War, comparable convoying mechanisms were employed to supply United Nations forces. In Vietnam, despite variations in terrain and battlefield circumstances, truck convoys continued to be indispensable to American military operations. Modern military logistical planning and execution still draw extensively from the methodologies of the Red Ball Express. The engineering of the GMC CCCKW significantly influenced global truck development in the post-war era. Its 6x6 drivetrain configuration became the benchmark for military medium tactical trucks. The strategy of utilizing mass-produced, easily serviceable vehicles rather than highly specialized military designs gained widespread acceptance. Nations worldwide emulated or adapted CCKW features for their own military truck programs. Soviet engineers, recipients of thousands of CCKWs through the Lend-Lease program, conducted thorough analyses of these vehicles. Post-war Soviet military trucks, including the ZIL series, exhibited evident influences from the CCKW in their structural layout and capabilities. The Soviets recognized that the CCKW's paramount advantage lay not in any single technical specification, but in its comprehensive package of competent performance, straightforward maintenance, and abundant availability. Contemporary military vehicles far surpass the CCKW in sophistication, incorporating advanced features such as computers, automatic transmissions, central tire inflation systems, and protective armor. However, they continue to confront the same fundamental challenge: how to ensure the reliable transport of supplies under combat conditions while maintaining sufficient simplicity for field repairs. Every military truck designer since 1945 has operated within the long shadow cast by the CCKW, striving to replicate its balance of capability and simplicity. The CCKW demonstrated that excellence in military equipment is not solely defined by having the most cutting-edge specifications. The British were accurate in their assessment that the ACKWX was underpowered and possessed limitations in its handling. However, they erred in their understanding of what truly constituted critical factors. In the context of total warfare, adequately performing vehicles produced in vast quantities ultimately triumph over superior vehicles manufactured in limited numbers. Trucks that can be repaired by mechanics using basic tools prove more effective than those requiring specialized equipment and factory-level support. Simplicity itself represents a distinct form of sophistication. The British military, which initially declined the ACKWX in 1940, eventually operated thousands of CCKWs provided through Lend-Lease. British drivers came to appreciate the very characteristics that their initial evaluations had criticized. The extended wheelbase, which initially seemed unwieldy on Europe's narrower roadways, provided exceptional stability for heavy cargo. The engine, perceived as underpowered, demonstrated sufficient strength and remarkable dependability. Its straightforward design meant that British mechanics, accustomed to maintaining complex vehicles requiring precise attention, could keep CCKWs operational with whatever tools and spare parts were at hand. A British transport officer documented in his post-operational report that the American trucks, initially dismissed as rudimentary, proved superior in sustained operations compared to British vehicles that necessitated more intricate maintenance protocols. The CCKW's capacity to remain functional despite neglect and rough handling rendered it ideal for the chaotic demands of combat logistics. British units began to favor CCKWs over their own indigenous trucks for lengthy journeys undertaken in challenging environments. The narrative of the GMC, CCKW, and the Red Ball Express ultimately illuminates the determinants of military victory. It is not achieved through the most advanced technology, the most impressive specifications, nor through vehicles that present favorably in promotional imagery or official demonstrations. Victory in warfare is secured by dependable equipment manufactured in quantities that overwhelm the adversary, operated by resolute individuals who grasp the profound significance of their mission. The CCKW was not the preeminent truck of the Second World War. It was adequate, yet adequate trucks, produced in hundreds of thousands and driven by individuals willing to labor until exhaustion, supplied the most successful military campaign in history. This unassuming 2.5-ton truck, scorned as inadequate by British experts in 1940, evolved into the vital artery sustaining Allied forces from Normandy to the Elbe River. And its drivers, a 75% contingent of African American soldiers fighting for a nation that still withheld fundamental civil rights, unequivocally proved that excellence transcends racial lines. They ensured the continued movement of the trucks, understanding that any interruption could lead to American soldiers running critically low on ammunition or fuel. They persevered through fatigue, through fear, and through discrimination, driven by the conviction that the mission superseded personal comfort or public acknowledgement. These individuals returned to a homeland that had not yet fully embraced their inherent dignity. Many encountered the same prejudice they had experienced prior to the war. However, they had undeniably established a crucial point. They had demonstrated that African American soldiers were fully capable of executing complex and critical assignments under the most arduous circumstances. They had exposed the fallacy of segregation, proving that capability and determination are entirely independent of an individual's skin color. The Red Ball Express became a significant component of the evidence that ultimately contributed to the dismantling of Jim Crow segregation in the decades following the war. On August 25, 1944, Sergeant William Henderson finalized the tightening of the last bolt on a CCKW engine, observing as the truck departed to join the ongoing convoy. The British had declared these vehicles to be of little worth. Henderson possessed a deeper understanding. He was aware that over the subsequent 82 days, these purportedly inferior machines would etch their indelible mark on history. Their legacy would not be forged through dramatic acts of combat or technological superiority, but through the relentless execution of simple, steadfast, and unglamorous labor, transporting essential supplies, maintaining the momentum of armies, and ultimately securing victory in the war. The GMC CCKW, affectionately known as the Jimmy, the Juice and a Half, simply the truck. The very vehicle the British rejected ultimately became America's clandestine advantage, the lifeline of the Red Ball Express. This stands as a testament that the most valuable assets are sometimes the most straightforward, operated by individuals resolute in their commitment to accomplishing their objectives, regardless of the obstacles.